In the summer of 1911, a man walked out of the eastern slopes of the Cumberland Plateau with a fever, a torn coat, and a leather notebook so waterlogged that the pages had fused into one solid brick. His name was Cassian Verharin. He was 34 years old, born in Antwerp, raised in Boston, and by that summer he had been out of the United States for the better part of 2 years. He was a surveyor by training, an ethnographer by inclination, and by the reckoning of the small New England museum that had paid his passage, a nuisance. He kept sending letters home that read like sermons. He kept spending the museum's money on interpreters they had not authorized. He was, by his own admission in one of the few letters from that year that has survived without redaction, becoming difficult to work with. Difficult and convinced that the map of what lived under the Appalachians was wrong. Verharin was tall, 6 foot and a hair, built lean with the kind of forearms that come from years of holding a plumb line steady in wind. He kept his hair short, because at altitude anything longer got sweat frozen against the scalp overnight. His face was long, his nose broken twice. Once by a horse in Massachusetts and once by a mule in West Virginia he had tried to argue with. He wore steel-rimmed spectacles that he cleaned obsessively. And when he was thinking hard about something, he had a habit of touching the small scar under his left eye, as if the thought lived there and needed a little encouragement to come out. He had come to the Appalachians in the spring of 1909, first to Tennessee, then up through Kentucky, then over into the southern half of West Virginia. He had been looking in that vague way that 30-year-old scholars sometimes look for a subject that would not have been picked over by the men who had preceded him. What he had found instead was that the picking over was at that latitude a great deal less complete than the museums back home believed. There were hollows that no European had entered with a notebook. There were dialects that had never been written down in any script. There were mountains that had names in Cherokee and Shawnee that would have astonished the missionaries who had for 200 years been claiming to have converted the people who spoke those names. He wrote in a letter home in the winter of 1910 that a man could spend a lifetime in that country and still at the end not know what half of it thought about the world. He had 2 years of that country in him by the time he heard the rope maker in Hazard talk about the Hornstone. He was already by then a different man from the one who had arrived. He had lost about 15 pounds. He had grown a short beard that came in more red than the hair on his head, which had surprised him. He had learned that at high altitude most decisions felt more urgent than they were, and that a wise traveler learned to sleep on them before acting. He had not, however, learned to sleep on this one. In April of that year, he arrived at a village on the eastern shoulder of a range that no railway would touch for another 40 years. On paper, the village was called Yana Muk, which in the language spoken there translated roughly as Black Crown or the darkness at the top of the head. It sat at an altitude of about 4,000 feet in a bowl of grass and stone that looked from a distance like a crater someone had left out in the rain. Fewer than 80 people lived there. They raised goats. They traded down the hollow twice a year for salt and iron, and the small useful things that only came out of towns. Verharin was the third outsider they had seen that year, and by their own count the fourth in a decade. The first two had been tacksmen from the county seat. The third had been a circuit preacher from Pikeville who had come, said a sermon, drunk a good deal of white lightning and left. Verharin stayed. He had been granted permission by the regional surveyor to map the drainage that ran below the village on the pretext that a rail spur might one day be pushed through. Everyone in Yana Muk, from the justice of the peace down to the last Gothard, understood perfectly well that no rail spur would ever climb into that bowl, and that Verharin must therefore be there for something else. They tolerated him. They were polite. They fed him. They also, without ever quite saying no, kept him from doing the one thing he had come to do, which was to walk up to the shoulder of a mountain called Wakra Rumi, the Hornstone, and enter the caves on its western face. He had first heard of the caves from a rope maker in Hazard. The man's name was Ishmael Cole Puma, and he kept a small shop on a side street 3 doors down from a pharmacy that sold, among other things, powders that no pharmacy in Boston would have carried. Ishmael made ropes from goat wool, and from a long dark fiber that he cut himself twice a year on a trip up the hollow he would not name. He was, when Verharin met him, in his 60th year. He had a jaw like the corner of a stone wall and hands that were younger than the rest of him. He had spent his younger years, he said, in a village 3 hollows east of Yana Muk. He had left that village at the age of 19 and had not been back in 40 years and had no plans to ever go back. Verharin had gone to Ishmael's shop for rope. He had come away with the beginning of everything that followed. It was Ishmael, after his 3rd cup of moonshine in the small back room of the shop, who had told Verharin that if he was truly interested in the old religion, in what people had believed before the missionaries had come, and long before the white man had come to that country, then he ought to go to the Hornstone. The rope maker had said it in a way that Verharin had taken at first for the usual mystic hint that guides gave to buyers. Except that when Verharin had pressed him for more, Ishmael had put down his cup and looked at him with a sudden and complete sobriety, and said that Verharin should not go, that no one who had gone had come back the same, and that if he insisted on going, he should at least go with a guide born within sight of the mountain, and he should do exactly what the guide told him to do, and he should not, no matter what, argue with the guide once they had begun the climb. And then he had picked his cup back up and refused to say another word on the subject. When Verharin 3 weeks later had come back to the shop for a second rope and had tried again, Ishmael had looked at him for a long time and then had told him quite gently to please buy his rope and leave, and to not come back to the shop again. Verharin wrote all of this down that night. He had underlined the last part 3 times. Yana Muk welcomed him with the same measured cool it gave any traveler. He rented a room in the house of a widow named Sisa Poma, who cooked him beans and salt pork every evening, and who spoke a careful, formal English she seemed to have kept polished for exactly such occasions. She never asked what he was doing. She only on the 2nd night said that the season was turning, and that in another month the passes above the village would be dangerous, and that if a man had business elsewhere, he ought to see to it soon. Verharin nodded and thanked her and went on eating. For the first week he did nothing that looked like surveying. He walked the village. He drank sassafras tea with the justice of the peace, a small round man named Upupanki Waman, who wore a black felt hat that he never took off even indoors. He sat in the doorway of the little church and watched the light change on the eastern wall of the bowl. He drew maps that were half accurate and half invented, so that anyone who looked over his shoulder would see a surveyor at work and not a man cataloging exits. By the 2nd week, he had started to ask questions. He asked them the way an ethnographer is trained to ask them, sideways, over long silences, without ever setting the true question down on the table. He asked about grazing patterns. He asked about the old names for streams. He asked which peaks in the ring had names and which did not. And in the answers he began to notice something he had been half expecting and half hoping he was imagining. There was a shape in the conversation of Yana Muk that everyone walked around. When he asked about the peaks, people named 7. There were 8 visible from the plaza. When he asked which streams ran to the east, people traced 4 with their fingers. There were 5. When he asked on one occasion about a particular pale scar on the western face of the Hornstone, a scar that even from the plaza looked as though something had once been carved there and then chipped away, the woman he was speaking to, a weaver named Antuka Kilpa, simply looked at her loom and said in English, so soft he almost missed it, that some things had no names because they had no need of them. And would he like more tea? He did not press her. He wrote it down. By the 3rd week, he understood 2 things. The first was that the caves on the western face of the Hornstone were real, that everyone in Yana Muk knew they were real, and that they had been sealed by hand more than once over the course of at least 3 generations. The second was that no one in Yana Muk would take him to them, no matter what he offered. Not for silver, not for the promise of a letter to the surveyor general, not for the small vials of quinine and iodine that he had been trading for other favors. The refusal was not angry. It was not even precisely a refusal. It was the same shape as a door closing when a man is standing outside in the rain. The door does not argue with him. It just stops being open. And so on the 22nd day of his stay, Verharin went to see the elder Rumi Achi. Rumi Achi lived alone in a small stone house at the northern edge of the village on a little rise that gave him a view of both the plaza and the Hornstone. He was by the reckoning of the village past 80. He looked older than that. His face was cut so deep with lines that in the wrong light it looked as though he had been carved from a piece of driftwood. He was thin. His hands were long and bent and stained brown from a lifetime of tobacco, and the small bitter roots he prepared for the people who came to him at night with complaints they could not name. He was the curandero of Yana Muk. He was also, though no one in the village used the word out loud, its last real memory. He knew what the village had done in the summer of 1876 when a Jesuit named Father Alcaraz had come up from the mission at Palcart and had refused to leave the Hornstone alone. Father Alcaraz had gone up the north path 3 times over the course of a month. He had gone up the first time with a guide, the second time with a guide who had turned back, the third time alone. On that third time, he had opened the seal of the first cave, which was the shallowest of the 3, and had come out again by nightfall, and had walked back down to Yana Muk with an expression on his face that the villagers who saw him arrive in the plaza would remember individually and separately for the rest of their lives. Father Alcaraz had said very little that evening. He had eaten, he had drunk, he had gone to bed in the small room the justice of that day had lent him. In the morning he had risen, walked out of the plaza before the sun, cleared the ridge, and set off down the hollow without saying goodbye. He had reached the mission at Palcartambo 6 days later. He had lived another 11 years in a small room off the mission chapel, and he had never in those 11 years spoken a single word aloud to any human being. He had heard confessions with a hand raised, and he had given absolution with a small nod. Rumiachi had heard this story from his own mother, who had been a young woman in Yana Muk when Father Alcaraz had come. He had told it to no one. He knew also what the village had done in the winter of 1891, when a Frenchman with a broken theodolite had begged for a guide, and been given at last a companion, who had led him only in a circle and back down the hollow. He knew what had been placed at the mouth of the western cave every solstice going back further than any book in Kentucky could account for. And he had in his long life spoken about none of it to anyone who was not born within sight of the Hornstone. He received Verharin on the small step in front of his house with a blanket over his knees and a bowl of tobacco leaves at his hip. He did not invite him inside. He did not offer him tea. He listened in the same careful, still way that a river listens to a stone falling into it, while Verharin, through the justice's nephew, a man of 22 who had spent time on the coast, explained who he was, what he had come to Kentucky to do, and what he had begun to understand about the western face of the Hornstone. Verharin had prepared a speech. He had rehearsed it 3 times the night before in English and in his broken Cherokee. He had meant to be respectful. He had meant to make himself small. But standing there on that step, with the wind coming off the bowl, and the old man looking at him as calmly as a lake looks at a bird, he heard himself speaking too fast, too eagerly, too much like a man asking for a favor he had no right to ask. When he had finished, there was a long silence. The old man reached into his bowl. He took out 3 tobacco leaves. He arranged them on the flat of his palm, points inward, and looked at them for what felt to Verharin like a full minute. Then he said through the interpreter that Verharin was not the first foreigner to come to Yana Muk with a bright idea about the Hornstone. He said that some of those foreigners had been sent away with courtesy. Some had been sent away with lies. And a very few, the ones who had not listened, had gone up to the western face with a guide who had at the last moment turned back. And of those very few, some had come back down to the village, and some had not. And of those who had come back down, some had gone on to live long lives, and some had not. He said that Verharin was welcome to stay in Yana Muk as long as he wished. He was welcome to survey any stream. He was welcome to draw any map. He was welcome even to walk on the lower slopes of the Hornstone, to touch its stone, to gather its little bitter flowers. But he was not to enter the western face. He was not to break the seals. He was not to open what had been closed. Not because the village would stop him. The village would not stop him, but because the village would not go up after him, and because what was in the western face did not deal with people who had not paid. Verharin, thinking he had understood, asked what payment would be sufficient. The old man smiled. It was the only smile Verharin ever saw on his face. He said through the interpreter that the payment was not silver and not iron, and not anything that a man from Boston could carry in a satchel. The payment had been agreed to a very long time ago. It was renewed each year, and it was paid in a currency that Verharin, if he was fortunate, would never learn the name of. And that if he tried to enter the western face without having paid, he would not be turned back at the door. He would be let in, and that was worse. Verharin thanked him. He went back to the widow Sisapoma's house. He wrote in his notebook that he had never in his life spoken to a man so certain of what he was saying, or so unwilling to embellish it. He wrote that he could think of no way to interpret Rumiachi's warning that did not oblige him as a scholar to try to see what had produced such a warning. He wrote at the bottom of the entry, in a hand that was already less steady than the rest, that he understood he was making a mistake, and that he was going to make it anyway. And since we're here in the middle of this story is being narrated by Echoes of Dread. If you're enjoying it, please subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing. It tells the platform to bring more of these to you. And if you're listening to this on another channel, and it does not have our name on the screen, know that they have taken our work without our permission. Report it to us. Thank you for being here. Verharin needed a guide. He knew it before Rumiachi had said it. Even a mountain that a determined man could climb in a day was not a thing to climb alone at that altitude and weather that changed by the hour, on a face that had been sealed by hands he could not know. And so on the 25th day of his stay, he set about finding a guide who would take him where no one in Yana Muk wished to go. The man he found was named Amaru Chukimiya. Amaru was 36. He was short and broad in the shoulders and had the long, patient face of a man who had spent his adult life among animals that took a long time to make up their minds. He had been widowed the year before. He had a younger brother in Sikwani, a man of 30 who had lost the use of both legs in an accident with a coal cart, and who now depended entirely on what Amaru could send down every month by mule. Amaru was in the arithmetic of that summer the only man in Yana Muk who needed silver badly enough to consider what Verharin was proposing, and educated enough by his travels down the hollow to know the difference between a foolish outsider and a dangerous one. Amaru said no the first time. He said no the second time. On the third time, when Verharin offered him not silver, but a promise in writing that a monthly sum would be sent to his brother in Sikwani for the next 5 years, whether Amaru returned from the Hornstone or not. Amaru sat for a long time with his hands folded in his lap. Then he said, in the quiet way of a man closing a door on his own future, that he would take Verharin up, but only to the mouth of the western face. He would not go inside, and he would not carry a lamp. Verharin agreed to all of it. He wrote the letter to Amaru's brother that night. He witnessed it himself in front of the justice of the peace, who signed it without comment and without looking at either of them for very long. They left at dawn 2 days later on the morning of the 28th of May, 1911. The wind was low. The bowl was full of that particular pale light that at high altitude comes before the sun clears the ridge. Sisapoma packed Verharin a pouch of dried lamb and beans and a small bottle of clear liquor that she said was for after, not before. She did not ask where he was going. She did not need to. She stood at the door of her house and watched him and Amaru walk out of the plaza until they were small on the north path. And then she went back inside and did not come out for the rest of that day. The walk up to the western face of Wakra Rumi took them almost 7 hours. They followed a stream for the first 2, then a bare grass slope for another 2, then a scree field, then a hard climb on rock that had been worn smooth by the passing of centuries of hooves and boots that were not, Verharin noted with a small and precise dread, in any of the records he had read. The path had been used and used and used. And then at some point that could not be dated, it had been abandoned. Not overgrown, there was nothing to overgrow, simply left, in the way that people leave a chair pulled out from a table when they have been called to something else and have not come back. They stopped once at a spring about halfway up. Amaru drank. Verharin drank. Neither of them spoke. Verharin had learned by then that Amaru did not want to be asked things. It was not sullenness. It was that Amaru, having agreed to do the thing, was already inside it in a way that Verharin, still narrating himself in a notebook, was not. They reached the western face just past noon. The face was not what Verharin had expected. He had pictured from the plaza a wall of rock like a cathedral front with a single dark mouth in it, dramatic and obvious. What he found when he came up over the last shelf of scree was a broad concavity in the mountain 300 or 400 feet wide, with a floor of shattered stone and no single visible entrance at all. The pale scar he had seen from below was up close, a low band of carving, older than Cherokee, older, in Verharin's guess, than any script he had a name for. The lines were shallow. Wind had worked at them for a very long time. They ran in a level ribbon across the concavity at the height of a man's shoulder, and they went on unbroken for as far as he could follow them. Verharin traced part of it with a fingertip. He wrote that night that the carving did not read left to right, and it did not read right to left, and it did not seem to be in any sense that his training had prepared him for writing at all. It was, he wrote, more like a fence, something meant to be seen from the inside by whatever the carvers had wanted to keep on the other side of it. He had never in his life had that particular thought about a piece of carved rock before, and he did not in his later life ever have it again. The cave mouths were behind the shattered stone. There were 3 of them. 2 had been sealed with dry stone walls, so old that the mortar had turned to a pale grit that came away on Verharin's palm when he touched it. The 3rd had been sealed with a single flat slab of what looked on first inspection like the same rock as the face itself, but which on closer inspection had been cut to fit and set into place by hands that had known what they were doing. Amaru sat down at the base of the scree and would not come closer. He said in English that he had done what he had agreed to do. He said he would wait. He said that if Verharin was not back down by sundown, he would go down without him, and he would tell the justice, and the village would come up in the morning and reseal what Verharin had opened. He said all of this without looking at the face. He said it in the same measured tone that a man uses to read out a will. Verharin asked him one more question. He asked what was inside. Amaru sat with that for a while. Then he said, still not looking at the face, that his grandfather had told him long ago that there were things in the mountain that were not people, and had never been people, and that they were not evil the way a wolf is not evil, and that they had lived in the mountain longer than the mountain had had a name, and that they had made an arrangement with the people who lived near it. The arrangement was old and had been kept, and that when it was kept, the mountain was quiet, and that when it was broken, the mountain was not quiet. Verharin asked what the arrangement was. Amaru said that he did not know the whole of it. He said that what he did know he would not say aloud in front of the western face. He said that Verharin should not open the 3rd door. He said that if Verharin opened the 3rd door, he should not go in far. He said that if Verharin went in far, he should not answer if he was spoken to. And then he said with a kind of exhaustion that Verharin wrote down verbatim that night in the widow's kitchen, that he did not know why he was telling him any of this, because he already knew Verharin would open the door. Verharin opened the door. It took him almost 2 hours. The slab was heavy, and it had been set with a lip that fitted into a groove cut into the rock above and below. He had to work at it with a crowbar he had carried up specifically for the purpose, and by the end his palms were raw and his shirt was soaked through, and Amaru had not moved from the scree once. When the slab finally came free, it did not fall. It rocked once and settled forward against the face, and left a mouth of darkness behind it about the width of 2 men standing shoulder to shoulder, and about the height of a man ducking to enter a low door. The first thing that came out was cold, not the cold of a cave. Verharin had been in caves. He had spent a summer as a student working in the karst country of southern Belgium. He knew what cave cold felt like on the face. This was not that. This was a cold that came out with weight. It came out the way water comes out of a broken pipe, with pressure. As if the mountain had been holding it in and was in some slow, patient way relieved to have it back in the world. Verharin felt it flow around his knees. He felt it settle on the stone at his feet. He looked down and saw quite clearly a thin white curl of vapor at the mouth of the cave, as if warm air from inside were meeting the cold outside, except that the direction was wrong. The cold was coming out. The warm was already there. The second thing that came out was smell. He wrote it down as sweet. He revised the word twice in the notebook, first to sweet, then to metallic sweet. Then finally, in a hand he barely recognized as his own, to the smell of a room where something has been kept for a very long time, in a way that was not quite alive and not quite anything else. He could not do better than that. He tried. The third thing that came out was sound. It was very faint. It was so faint that at first he thought it was his own blood in his ears. He held his breath. It was not his blood. It was, or it seemed to be, a sound like a large number of very small voices, all speaking at once, all at the edge of intelligibility, none of them ever quite resolving into a word he could catch. It went on for perhaps 5 seconds. Then it stopped. Then, a moment later, it started again in a slightly different key. Verharin looked back at Amaru. Amaru was standing. He had come in the 2 hours that Verharin had been working on the slab, perhaps 30 paces closer to the face. He was standing on the scree with his hat off, holding it against his chest with both hands. His face from that distance was unreadable. He did not move as Verharin looked at him. He did not speak. He simply stood there holding his hat with the wind pulling at his hair. Verharin went in. He wrote later that he did not know why he went in. He wrote that he had every intention of only stepping to the threshold, of only looking, of only listening for another moment, and then coming back out and sealing the door himself with his own hands and walking down, and never mentioning any of it to anyone. He wrote that as he stood on the threshold and lit the small carbide lamp he had brought, he understood clearly that he was making a mistake, and that he was making it in full knowledge, and that he was going to make it anyway, because there was a thing in him older than his good sense, that had wanted all his life to know what was behind sealed doors, and that thing had won. He took 10 paces in, then 20. Then he stopped counting. The passage sloped down. It was not in its architecture a natural cave. Someone had cut it or had helped it. The walls were smooth in a way that natural walls are not. The floor was flat in a way that natural floors are not. There were no marks of tools. There were also no marks of water, which at that altitude in a mountain that sheds snow 6 months of the year was so wrong that Verharin felt it before he understood it. There should have been water damage. There should have been mineral streaks. There was nothing. The stone was clean. The lamp made a small hard circle of light. Outside the circle, the darkness was so complete that when he turned his head, he had a strong and repeated sensation that the darkness was watching him. He would turn and find nothing wrong. Then he would turn again and feel it happen again. He walked down for what he estimated was 15 minutes. The passage did not branch. It went in a long, slow, patient curve to the left, the way a snail's shell curves. He remembered at some point that snails' shells curve the same way, whether they are in France or in Kentucky. He remembered that he had once given a lecture about that. He heard himself in his own head giving the lecture. It steadied him. He kept walking. The chamber opened without warning. The passage ended and the walls fell away, and his lamp was suddenly not enough. He could not see the far side. He could not see the ceiling. He could see in the small hard circle at his feet that the floor of the chamber sloped gently down toward a lower place he could not resolve, and that in the middle of that lower place there was or seemed to be a pit. It was not a natural pit either. It was almost perfectly circular. It was rimmed with a low, worn lip of stone that had been polished over an unimaginable time by the passing of something over it. Verharin did not go closer. He did not need to. He stopped on the sloping floor about 20 paces from the rim, and he held his lamp up as high as his arm would go, and he listened. The voices were louder in the chamber. They were still not words. They were, he wrote, the way a room sounds when you enter it late at night and know that people have just stopped talking about you. They were the sound of an interrupted conversation. He stood there for a long time. He counted his own heartbeat. He got to 200 and stopped counting. He noticed once he had stopped counting that the air in the chamber was moving, not with the vertical fall of cold air draining out of the passage. Something else. A slow, patient circulation, as if the room breathed. It did not breathe like a lung. It breathed like a slow current in a still pool. The vapor from his own mouth would drift in the small hard circle of his lamp out, and then to the left, always to the left, and then it would vanish. He held his hand up. He felt the movement on the back of his fingers. It was not strong enough to feel like wind. It was strong enough to feel like being noticed. He wrote later that he had understood then, standing on that sloping floor with the pit ahead of him, that he had come into a place that was not empty, and had never been empty, and that whatever was in the chamber with him had known from the moment the slab had rocked forward that he was going to arrive. It had known, and it had been waiting, and it had been in no particular hurry. And then, very clearly from the pit, he heard his own name, not shouted, not whispered, spoken, in a tone of mild interest, in a tone of at last, in a voice that was not a voice he knew. That was not a voice he could place. That was not a man's or a woman's. That was not even, he wrote, the voice of anything he understood as having lungs. It was simply the shape of his name coming up out of the pit the way a bubble comes up in a slow river. Cassian Verharin. He did not answer. He remembered Amaru's warning. He did not answer. The voice waited. It waited the way a person waits at a door for someone they know is inside. And then very slowly it said something else. He could not later reproduce the words. He tried. He wrote 3 approximations in the notebook, and he crossed all 3 of them out. What he wrote in the final version was only that the voice from the pit named someone he had loved and asked a question about them that no one in Kentucky could have known to ask, and that he had felt. In the moment the question was asked, a tug behind his sternum, as if a hook had caught in something very small and very deep, and was without pain trying to draw it out. He ran. He turned so fast that his lamp swung wild and threw the shadow of his own head across the far wall for a moment. And in that moment he saw, or thought he saw, on the wall the outlines of shapes that were not shadows of the lamp. He did not stop to look. He ran back up the passage. He ran hunched and gasping and half-blind, and by the time he came out at the mouth of the cave, the light of the day struck him so hard that he fell to his knees on the scree and vomited twice, and could not get up for a full minute. A breath here, before what comes next. If this is the kind of story you'd want to sit with in the dark, not just hear it once, but keep it, there's a collection I put together with the people at Forbidden Unresolved Stories. What the Mountain Keeps. 10 complete cases, 8 hours, 60, 2 years of records nobody wanted to finish. Each one placed, dated, and signed off with a tidy word that never once fit what happened. The link is in the description below and at the top of the comments. Let's go back to it. When Verharin did get up, Amaru was standing right at the mouth of the cave. Right at it. Not 30 paces back. Not on the scree with his hat off. At the very mouth. So close that Verharin in getting to his feet almost walked into him. Amaru was looking past him into the cave. His face was calm. His mouth was slightly open. He was not blinking. Verharin said his name. He said it 3 times. Amaru did not answer the first 2 times. On the third, he blinked slowly, as if remembering how, and looked at Verharin and said in a very ordinary tone that they should go down now. That the sun was going. They went down. They resealed the slab first. Amaru did most of the work. He was strong in a way that a widowed goatherd should not have been strong, and he lifted the slab into place with a kind of even, unremarked effort that unnerved Verharin more than anything the mountain had yet produced. They did not speak on the walk down. When the wind picked up halfway down the scree, Amaru said without turning his head that Verharin should not sleep alone that night. Verharin asked what he meant. Amaru did not answer. They came into Yana Muk after dark. The village was quiet. There was no lamp lit in any window that faced the north path. The widow Sisapoma was awake in her kitchen. She had a small fire going and a pot of something on it. And when she saw Verharin, she looked at him for a long time, and then without a word she poured him a cup of the clear liquor. She had packed him that morning, and she made him drink it. And she pointed at the small cot in the corner of her kitchen, and told him in her careful English that he would sleep there tonight and not in his room, and he was not to argue with her, and he was not to get up in the dark. He slept in her kitchen, or he thought he did. He wrote in the report that no one at the museum ever read carefully, that he had woken twice in the night. The first time to find the fire had burned down almost to embers, and to hear the sound of his own breathing coming faintly from the other side of the room, where no one was sitting. He had lain still for a long time listening to it. It had, he wrote, the exact cadence of his own breath. It had matched him on the exhale. It had matched him on the inhale. When at last he had held his breath to test the thing, the breathing on the other side of the room had not stopped. It had gone on patient and quiet for perhaps 5 more inhalations. Then it had stopped. Then he had let his own breath out, and the room had been silent, and he had lain awake until dawn without moving. The second time he had woken, only for a moment, was to the sound of a stone shifting outside the kitchen window. A single small stone, as if someone had passed the wall and had brushed it in the passing. He did not get up. He did not, as Sisapoma had told him, get up in the dark. In the morning when he woke, Sisapoma was already gone. Amaru was also gone. His door was open. His small house, the one he had lived in alone since his wife had died, was empty. His bed had not been slept in. His Gothard's blanket, the one he took everywhere, was folded on the table with a stone on it, as if to keep it from blowing away. His boots were not in the house. His hat was not in the house. His boots were at the mouth of the western cave. They were found by the two men from Yana Muk who went up the north path that morning with a mule and the tools to reinforce the seal. They said, when they came back down, that the slab was still in place. They said that they had not opened it. They said that the boots had been set together neatly side by side on the flat stone, just outside the sealed mouth, and that the laces had been tied. They said nothing else. Amaru Chukimia was never seen in Yana Muk again. His brother in Sikwani continued to receive every month for the next 5 years the sum that Verharin had promised. Verharin paid it himself out of what remained of his own money, and later out of a lecturer's salary at a small college in Ohio. When the 5 years were up, the brother in Sikwani wrote a short letter of thanks in a careful, tutored hand, and that was the last that was written about Amaru Chukimia by anyone who had known him. Verharin stayed in Yana Muk for another 4 days. He did not go back up to the western face. He asked to see Rumi Achi again, and Rumi Achi received him again on the same step in front of his little house, and this time he did invite him inside, and this time he did give him tea. They sat together for a long time before either of them spoke. When the old man finally spoke, it was in English. Verharin had not known until that moment that he spoke any English at all. He said that Verharin had done what he had been told not to do. He said that Verharin had come back down. He said that most of the ones who came back down whole, and that Verharin was by the look of him whole. That the thing in the mountain had taken what it took, which was not the whole of a man, and Verharin would live and would live long, and would notice at odd hours for the rest of his life that something was missing. Something small. Something so small that if he had not been the one who had been carrying it, no one else would ever notice it was gone. But he was the one who had been carrying it, and he would notice. Verharin asked what the thing in the mountain was. The old man did not answer that. He said instead that the arrangement between the village and the mountain had been made in a time before the village had a name. He said that once each year, at the shortest night, the village went up to the western face and left at the mouth of the third cave something that could be left. He said he would not tell Verharin what it was. He said that Verharin did not need to know. He said that the thing in the mountain did not eat and did not sleep, and did not want silver, and had no use for iron, and did not care about prayers. It wanted something else, and the village gave it. And the mountain was quiet. He said that when a man came into the mountain who had not paid, the mountain did not turn him away. The mountain welcomed him in the same way it welcomed the offering. It took from that man in the same way. And most of the men who had come in this way, and had lived to come back out, had lived long and unremarkable lives afterward. Some had not lived long. A very few had lived very long, and had not at the end been remarkable in any of the ways they had been remarkable when they went in. It was, the old man said, hard to know in advance. He said that Amaru Chukimia had some years before done a small service for the mountain. He did not say what the service was. He said only that Amaru had been marked for it, and that in the moment Verharin had opened the slab, Amaru had been called and had gone the way the village would have expected him to go if it had known he had been marked, which it had not. He said that this was not Verharin's fault. He said it flatly and without kindness, as one might say that it was not the rain's fault that a roof had leaked. Then he said that Verharin should leave in the morning, and that he should not come back, and that he should not write about Yana Muk, or about the Hornstone, or about the third cave in any book that anyone would read. That if he needed to write it down for his own sake, he should write it down and hide it and not tell anyone where it was and not in his lifetime allow it to be found. Verharin promised. He kept most of the promise. He left Yana Muk the next morning. Sisapoma made him coffee. She gave him back the little bottle of liquor. She said in her careful English that she was sorry for what had happened and that she hoped his brother was well. And Verharin said without correcting her that his brother was well, though he had no brother. He walked down the hollow for 3 days. On the second day it rained. His pack was not properly waterproofed. His notebook, which he had wrapped in oilcloth, was in the outer pocket of the pack, and the oilcloth had a small tear that he had not noticed, and the rain got in. When he unpacked that night in a stable at the edge of a tobacco farm, the notebook came out as a single fused brick of pulp. The pages could not be separated. The ink had run through into the leather. What he had written he had lost. He did not, so far as anyone has been able to determine, sit down and rewrite it. He wrote some months later a short and careful report for the museum in New England describing a preliminary geological survey of the eastern drainages of a mountain in West Virginia, and noting that further work was not recommended due to the difficulty of the terrain and the reluctance of the local population to permit access. The report was filed. It was not read closely. Nothing further was done. Cassian Verharin lived as Rumi had said he would, a long life. He never returned to West Virginia. He took a position at a small college in Ohio, where he taught surveying and later an introductory course in comparative religion that his colleagues privately considered eccentric. He married at 40, won a woman named Elsa Vandermeer, who had come from his own city in Belgium and who had known his family there. They lived quietly. He kept a garden. He read a great deal, mostly history, mostly of countries other than America. He rose each morning at 4:45 and drank coffee alone in the kitchen for half an hour before Elsa came down. In that half hour, according to a note she wrote in her own diary in the year of his death, he would sometimes sit very still and stare at a point on the wall above the stove, and if she came in and asked what he was thinking about, he would smile at her and say quite pleasantly that he was trying to remember something and could not, and it was of no importance. He said this, she wrote perhaps twice a week for 35 years. She never asked him what it was. She never quite dared. He died in his sleep in the winter of 1953 at the age of 76. Among his papers, which were donated after his wife's death to the archive of the small college where he had taught, there was a sealed envelope. It had been sealed with a wax stamp of his own design, a small horn inside a circle. The envelope had been kept in the bottom drawer of his desk for the last 42 years of his life. It was opened by an archivist in the summer of 1974, at which point the wax had gone brittle, and the paper of the envelope was the color of old bone. Inside was a single sheet. On it, in Verharin's careful small hand, was written the following: I have left something in that mountain. I do not know what it is, but I feel its absence when I try to remember my own name in the morning. I have kept my word to the old man. I have not written the true account. What is written here is the whole of what I will ever say. If you are reading this, do not go looking for the mountain. If you go looking for the mountain, do not enter the third door. If you enter the third door, do not go far. If you go far, do not answer when it speaks. And if it speaks anyway, and you find that you have already answered, do not. Whatever you do, try to remember what you said. The archivist filed the sheet in the appropriate folder under the appropriate accession number in the appropriate box. The folder has been requested in the 50 years since by exactly 4 researchers. 2 were graduate students in American ethnography who wanted the paper for reasons that had nothing to do with a mountain. 1 was a distant relative of the widow Sisapoma who had heard a story in her family and had wanted to see if there was a document behind it. 1 was a journalist from Hazard in 2019 who had gone up to Yana Muk the year before and had come back convinced that the village still every year on the shortest night walked up the north path to the western face of the Hornstone and left something at the third door. The journalist has not, so far as anyone knows, published his article. The Hornstone is still there. The village is still there. The seal is still on the third cave. It has in the last 113 years been repaired 7 times, according to a rope maker in Hazard, who is the great-grandson of the rope maker who first told Cassian Verharin about the mountain. The great-grandson tells the same story his great-grandfather told in almost the same words to almost every foreigner who asks. He also, if you press him and if he trusts you, will say one thing that his great-grandfather did not say. He will say that when the seal is repaired, the men who do the repairing do not do it in silence. They speak while they work, and they do not, when they come back down, tell anyone what was said or who did the speaking. I do not know how to end this one. I have been sitting with it for weeks now, and every time I go to write the last line, I think about that sentence in Verharin's envelope, the one about trying to remember his own name in the morning. I think about what it would be like to lose something that's small, that's specific, that you would not even be able to name. Something so small that no one else would notice. Only you every morning, for the rest of a long, quiet, otherwise good life. I think that is the part of this that unsettles me most. Not what came up out of the pit, not what happened to Amaru Chukimia, not the boots at the mouth of the cave. It is the arithmetic of what the mountain took, small enough to survive, large enough to remember forever that it was gone. And you, have you ever felt, when you woke up in the morning, that something was missing that you could not name? Leave it in the comments if you have. I read them. I do not always answer, but I read them. If you know a story like this one, a story that a village or a family will not quite finish telling you, share it below. It may become the next one. And if you have not yet, and this is the kind of story you would want more of, the collection is called What the Mountain Keeps. The link is in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. 10 complete cases, 8 hours, 62 years of records nobody wanted to finish. Stay with us for the next account. Until then.